I spent the last 15 years or so developing and refining a lot of techniques and methods. I realized I haven't actually documented the process with any of my projects before, only the finished product. I divide my work between graphic design projects, two-dimensional paintings and collages, and three-dimensional models and dioramas. Ideally, they're all kind of inspiring and influencing each other, and there are a lot of overlapping ideas and themes, like layered textures, complex geometric structures, bold color palettes, minimal typography, and some kind of attempt at telling stories or suggesting narratives through design, particularly the idea of the buildup of history through crumbling layers, textures, patinas, that kind of thing. One thing that I've worked on pretty regularly over the years is the idea of creating animated films with a lot of paper, using a combination of dirty handmade techniques and precise digital composition. The idea is that I can set up a repetitive process, one which involves a lot of handmade and unpredictable techniques, and then apply that process to each frame of an animated film. I recently recorded some ambient synth music, as you do, and I used this animation method to create a looped video for each of the tracks. So for each one, I printed out all of the frames of a short cell phone video, and then I poured paint onto the printed out frames, sandpapered them, drew on them with pens and pencils and things like that, just to kind of create an organic, textured look to each one. Then I scanned them all back in and animated them to create the video loops. I did the same thing to some text layers separately, and then I layered that text on top of the images. So each frame of the animation ends up with a kind of unexpected organic interaction between the background image and the text layered on top. After finishing these animated loops, I wanted to bring the project back to a physical piece as a way to kind of document one entire loop in a way that allows you to see the entire project all at once, frozen in time. I put together an 11 by 11 grid of frames from one of the animations and decided to present all of them on a 2-foot square wooden panel. To prepare this panel and give it some interesting layers of surface detail, I used a few different processes I've developed over the years. I draw a lot of inspiration from wheat pasting, poster boards, and old paper billboards that were printed in pieces and reassembled on site, which is something I actually used to make as a printer many years ago in a previous career. The board starts with an abstract background image, divided up into 12 panels. This layer will mostly be covered by gray paint, and then the grid of animation frames will be layered on top of that. So I start by printing the background image on newsprint and cutting the panels to size. I've numbered these directly on the images because I kind of like letting the construction and organizational methods of the project stay visible in the finished piece. It has a sort of overly planned out utilitarian and industrial pointlessness that I kind of find pretty ridiculous. I kind of enjoy that, even though it's kind of unnecessary. I also print out the frames from the animation. Each one of these is 2 inches square. I've also numbered these, mainly so I can actually keep them in the right order, just in case I drop them on the floor or something like that. But that's also kind of a nod to that layer of unnecessary detail that's present in the piece. Next, I paint the entire panel itself white, just as a kind of neutral starting point for the pieces of paper to stick to. The first layer is the 12 newsprint background panels. First, I dip each one in watered-down white paint. I'm interested in applying texture and dirt in a lot of these projects in different ways to kind of contrast the precise grid of the layout with the sort of organic, dirty texture on the surface. Watering everything down means the paper rips and folds and tears, which lets the layers below show through. I'm going for a sort of rough marbled look with this, kind of using sort of gross house paint I've had sitting around for a long time. And I mainly just want to make sure it doesn't look too painterly or intentional with brush strokes showing through. I just want it to kind of look like an organic mess. After the panels have kind of dried out a little bit, I glue them onto the wooden panel with watered down glue. I usually paint a layer of glue on top of the paper once it's been attached to the wood, and then I smooth the whole thing down with one of these drywall scraping tools, so the entire thing is completely encased in glue and it's kind of solid, it's not going anywhere. Once that background layer is all dry, I cover the entire thing with grey paint. I want this to look weathered as well, so you can see the paper visible in places underneath and you get a kind of build-up of textures. Don't want any obvious brush strokes here, So I just kind of experiment with it, spreading the paint around, sanding it to keep it thin, and flatten the whole surface. When that's all dry, I go through that whole process again with the paper animation frames. So I dip these in watered down paint as well, so each one is kind of obscured and dirty. This process is interesting because it's what I did to create the animation frames in the first place. By this point, the original images have been printed out, messed up with paint, scanned back in, and printed a few times now. So there's this layering of digital and analog versions of the same surface treatment happening, which in a way is a form of documentation in itself, showing how the initial image has been obscured over and over in different interpretations of the same methods. Since there are so many of these little squares, I draw a pencil grid on the board to make sure they all line up properly. Then I start gluing them down with the watered down Elmer's glue. I do 3 or 4 of these at a time, letting the glue dry a little bit before going in with that scraping tool to kind of fold and scrape the corners and the edges of the squares, so you can see some of the layers underneath showing through. Not much of those initial layers are visible at this point, but hopefully there'll be some interesting details if you look hard enough. After gluing down all 121 squares, here's the finished project. Overall, I think it turned out pretty well, at least in terms of documenting the level of variation and detail you can get from applying the same process to a ton of slightly different images. The challenge with something like this is that the level of dirt and grime that gets applied to the images can often obscure the fact that they started out as a series of sequential images from an animation. Although looking at the individual images in this piece, you do start to see repetitive shapes and levels of brightness and detail that gradually change across the course of the entire project.